All right. That was all just the basics. That was just getting us started here. Now we're going to start talking about installation things. All right, so keys here: properly wire, protect the controls, properly charge, set airflow, and manage compression ratio. Almost everything that you run into is a problem with one of those, something related to that. And managing compression ratio is a tricky one, because all compression ratio means, and I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but now I'm going to. All it means is the difference between your head pressure and your suction pressure, right? And the further they are away from each other, the more inefficiently the system operates. But sometimes we don't have a choice, like I just said, because we do it on purpose to either get more heat out of it, i.e. cold climate, or to wring more moisture out of it on the evaporator side. Because when we say suction pressure, what we're really saying is evaporator temperature. And when we say head pressure, what we're really saying is condensing temperature. And on a heat pump, where's your condenser when you're in heat mode? Inside, right? And so if we want to get more heat out, what do we want to do? We want to increase our condensing temperature, which what does that do to compression ratio? Separates them, right? If we want to wring more moisture out, what do we want to do to evaporator temperature? Drop it. That separates them. That's inefficient. You're wasting energy if your goal was just to conserve energy. But frankly, this is what I always say. If our goal was to really conserve energy, because people get all energy focused, oh my goodness, we're going to save the world, it's the most important thing, we're in such an important trade. The best way to conserve energy is for all of us to shut off our air conditioners and heaters and just go back to the way it was. Right? That's like when people tell me they've got this, I've got this mid-century modern house. It's beautiful, it's got flat roofs, it's got all this stuff, and now I want you to fit an air conditioner in here. Have you guys ever had like a wealthy person? Rich people's houses, RPHs. Ever have an RPH? It gives you a design, and it's like there's no room for ductwork. And my answer is that is a beautiful mid-century house. I'm going to give you a mid-century air conditioner, which is open the doors and windows, right? Yeah, let the breeze come through, right? So when we talk about being concerned about energy, that's great so long as we're actually achieving our comfort goals, right? So you can't sacrifice those. And a lot of times with inverter-driven equipment, people lose sight of the fact that if you're not pulling moisture, you're not keeping things warm enough, you're not keeping them cool enough, your clients aren't going to be happy at the end. It doesn't matter if it's 30 SEER or 60 SEER or 100 SEER. The system that has the best SEER rating is the one that's not running. It's an amazing SEER rating. It's great. Yeah, incredible. All right. So cold climates. Anybody here in a cold climate where you're actually snowbanks, all that kind of stuff? All right, a few of you. I'm not going to belabor this point because it's fairly obvious, right? You keep them out of the snow. They have to be out of the snow, so that's pretty good. It's also where side discharge tends to work nicer in that regard, because now you don't have snow falling down into the equipment, and so it kind of makes sense. But you need to keep it up out of snowbanks, that kind of thing. When we talk about noise, I'm going to talk more about this, but the impulse that a lot of people have is to mount these things to the side of the building then in order to get it out of the snow. Not a huge fan of that because you do tend to get a lot of noise issues with that. A lot of people will say, well, inverter driven, they're amazingly quiet, phenomenally quiet. You go to it in the middle of summer once it's already at set point, oh man, they're just so quiet. You go back in the middle of winter when it's negative 10 degrees outside and it sounds like it's screaming its head off, because what's it doing? Spinning the compressor faster. And we're so used to things that operate on 60 hertz. There's all kinds of weird stuff that happens when you start changing the frequency. You get these weird resonant frequencies, you get weird noises, and you can't get rid of it. And so that's why I do not advise, if you can get away from it, I do not advise taking a cold climate heat pump and mounting it to the side of the building. If you're in Florida where I am, it's probably not that big of a deal because it's so rare that it's going to be spinning up like that. You're not going to have as much of an issue. But if you're in Boston or something like that, Ross Trethui, who's on this old house and he does all this stuff, he always designs, even in really nice houses, always designs them ground mounted on stands. Get them up off the ground, but mount them to the ground, get them a little bit away from the building so that way you don't have sound issues.
We're in the Boston market too, and we only mount to the side of the building if we get on the concrete. We never go to the wood.
Yeah.
So we can get an offset bracket off the foundation.
Yeah.
Not a block foundation, a port foundation with these good anchors. We've had success with that, but I always make folks sign off on, there could be a vibration or a squeak or a noise.
Right.
And they say, why don't you put it on pads?
Right, exactly, right. And that's, you know, and using signatures as a way to get people to say, "You sure you want to do this?" I love that. I love offer refuse in that way, where you say, "Oh, no problem at all. I'm just going to need you to sign right here that says that you're not going to hold me responsible," and that's all of a sudden the pen gets a little shaky in their hand, you know. It's kind of like the client who says, this is one of my favorite things. My grandpa always did this. He was a master of this. My grandpa was a master of the deal. And when people would say, like, all right, it's going to be $2,000, do whatever, he'd be like, well, I guess we got to do it. And that was not yes. Okay, when the client says that, oh, I guess I have no choice, I've learned to say, okay, so is that yes? Because you're not holding me responsible for this, right? Like, I'm doing this for you. And so anyway, anything noise related. Baseband heaters are huge. Installing them correctly, it's not just installing them, but installing them correctly in cold climates, that's a really big deal, and it's a big thing that comes up a lot because it's something that you don't know that it's a problem until you have your first big ice or snowstorm, and then it's a big problem. It's kind of like in our market, heat strips. Like, you almost never need them, but then all of a sudden it's a thing when you didn't wire them properly or whatever else happens. So you do need to pay close attention to it. And the thing that I'm going to say through this a lot, for those of you who are contractors, the way to solve a lot of your problems when it comes to install best practices with anything new is to create a very specific protocol. And that means that it's not just like a checklist, right? Because you know how checklists are, they just but like, okay, you're going to do this particular unit in this particular situation. Here is a specific set of things that you have to do for this job, right? Like this, I'm sending you with this baseband heater, and here is exactly how you wire it, right? Because what we do a lot is we'll say to our installers, just read the manual, or you just need to read the manual, knowing full well that they're not going to. And so then we blame them for the bad result when really we're the ones who end up bearing the consequences of the bad result. So just don't be silly, be very specific. That was one of the first jobs I ever had in training, was before I started Kalos and HVAC school and everything else. I worked for a really big contractor that had 800 employees, and my job was to train people to do startup and commissioning who had never really touched an air conditioner in their life. And the goal was within 90 days they were supposed to go out and do startup and commissioning. It's funny because we're kind of talking about this again, right? This is sort of a new thing that people are bringing up, which was it sounds like a very hard thing to do, but if you only sell a certain couple units, and there's a certain couple ways they need to be wired and set up and charged and pulled vacuum and all that stuff, it actually isn't as bad as it sounds. I mean, you're not expecting people to understand everything they're doing, you're expecting them to follow a set of practices. Now, is that the best way? Of course it's not, but it's a reality sometimes of what we face in the workforce. So just taking that really seriously. The next thing that I want to mention about this is how you get better results out of cold climate heat pumps in terms of capacity and efficiency. And that is to run lower compression ratio. And how do you run lower compression ratio on a cold climate heat pump? By bringing more air over the indoor coil. Right? Now, what's the problem with bringing more air over the indoor coil on a cold climate heat pump? Anybody know?
Drafty in the house.
It gets drafty, right? Clients don't like how it feels. So they don't like air being blown on them. I'm going to quote Jack Rise again. Number one rule of air design is don't blow air on people, right? So if you select your diffusers better, you design your duct system better, you direct it across the ceiling where possible, things like that, and you're not blowing air on people, then you can get away with running higher airflow over your indoor coil. And when you do that, you get better capacity and efficiency, meaning that in a very real way, when people feel that air and they're like, oh, that's cold. Oh man, we need to get warm that air up. And then you slow the air down over the coil and like, oh, now that feels warm, right? This goes back to fundamental misunderstanding of thermodynamics. It feels cooler when there's more air, but it's actually producing more BTUs. You're actually moving more BTUs when you do it that way. So we do want to maintain good indoor coil airflow. You agree with that, Ed?
I absolutely do.
Good. I'd see just a lot of this stuff is, Ed's a lot smarter than me on it, so I just got to check. All right. Once again, not going to cover like a lot of manufacturer-specific stuff. I use some examples here from Carrier because that's what we mostly install, although we are doing more different brands now. Number one thing here, and I know this sounds stupid, but is actually using a scale. Like, I know. It's like dumb sounding, but I'm telling you, I was one of those guys who was like, I think that was about 3 pounds, you know. I have a very well calibrated right arm, I'm telling you. I could always tell. And like the little shoulder, you know. A lot of guys are this way, and so they'll tell you they're using a scale. Oh yeah, I put 3 pounds in it, but like, do you know they were using a scale? It's one of the things that I would encourage you to develop into your processes, to actually have geotag photos of like, hey, this is the scale that, you know, because again, you can fake anything, but if you make it kind of harder to fake than just do the right thing, it sometimes encourages people to do the right thing. The other thing that I would do is in your van setups, I would do the scale right next to your recovery tanks and your charging tanks. Because if it's right there and you're like, hey, every time you pull off this tank, you pull off this scale. And also do the check, we call it the battery check, right? Where you show, you know, all right, let me take a look at oh, hey, this thing's dead. Oh yeah, it just ran out of batteries. Let me assure you, it did not just run out of batteries. It's like the micron gauge, where it's like, oh yeah, I just ran out of AAAs. No, you didn't. You're not using your micron gauge, right? And I am not an advocate for getting all pissy about it. Like, just recognize that tradespeople are often going to make excuses for doing things fast, rather than following the process. And so you just have to have things built in where you're checking that, where you're paying attention to it, right?
Bryan, you just said about the geotagging and catching people not doing what they're supposed to. Have you done the geotagging and has it helped?
Yes, we have. I mean, to the extent that, and again, on our residential team, I'm going to be real clear here. I started off as a residential contractor. Kalos was a very residential contractor. Now it's 10% of our overall business. So when I tell you things that we're doing, I'm not in that team every day, okay? So I'm working as much with our grocery refrigeration and our heavy commercial team and our electrical team and our controls team and everything else. So I would be lying to you to say I know for a fact that all that stuff's, but do we have those practices in place? Yes, we do. And have we seen, for example, a reduction in refrigerant going out the door? Yes, we have. And so that's a pretty good indication. Here's another thing I want to alert you to for anybody who didn't come from the field. If you came from the field, you know this. People use refrigerant for diagnostics all the time. Yep. All the time. And if you say you didn't do it, you're just lying, because we all did it, right? Just put a little refrigerant in it, or put a little Freon in it, depending on where you're from. Put a little refrigerant in it, see what it does, right? And then you just keep putting a little in, putting a little in, putting a little in, putting a little in. I had tell me if this sounds familiar. I had a young guy who works for me, great young guy. Really hard worker, but a little overzealous at times. And he comes up to me one morning and he says, hey boss, I need to talk about something. Okay. He's like, yeah, so is it normal to have to put like a lot of refrigerant in a new ductless system? And I said, Aaron, you're gonna need to tell me where this address is right now. And sure enough, we go and we pulled 20 pounds of extra 410A out of a ductless. It was a multi-head, but still 20 pounds. And of course, why is he doing that? Why does anybody ever just add a bunch of refrigerant into a system? What's the one indicator they're looking at? Suction pressure, that's what they're looking at. They're trying to get the suction up, right? That's what they're always trying to do. So, kind of giving them some guidelines of what to go in is going to be really important. Obviously, the 0.6 ounces per foot of additional 3/8 is kind of a standard thing, but it's not always 3/8, right? So you have to sometimes adjust. I have a calculator on the HVAC School app where you actually put in your suction and your liquid, and it compensates for both and tells you exactly how much you have to put in depending on the factory line charge. So for guys who struggle with math a little bit, it makes that a little bit easier. It'll also show it, because a lot of guys, depending on your scale, sometimes scales will just show ounces, sometimes they'll show pounds and ounces, and so it shows all of those to make it a little bit easier depending on how they're doing it. So that's a good way to do it. Also, when you're charging any sort of ductless system, especially, but some unitary inverter systems, when in doubt, weigh it out. Like when you really aren't sure, it's best to just weigh it out. And no, you're not going to put it back in again, so that is going to cost you some money. This is another quick note. I didn't say this in the last one, but I want you all to know this, that those recovery tanks that you were given by a supplier, they are not clean. They are not. If you cut them open and you look, there is almost certainly sludge down in the bottom of that recovery tank. They just take it and they just empty it and they just put new refrigerant in it and they just back and forth. That's all that ever happens with that. And so if they did a burnout, the last guy did a burnout compressor and there's a bunch of sludge in that, and again, it's coming out liquid in a lot of cases, so it's carrying a bunch of contaminants with it. So any of you, if you have a practice of returning refrigerant to a system, just know that it's risky. If you run it through a line dryer, it's a lot better than having another compressor fail. So in a lot of cases, you're just going to have to weigh it out. There are some good guidelines that you can follow, but again, the problem is that you have these algorithms built into the equipment that we don't have full access to always, that are doing things, ramping condenser speed, ramping compressor, changing blower, all that, electronic expansion valves, that sometimes can be really tricky for your field tech. Now, it's often not as complicated as you imagine it is. It's often more really just looking at saturated suction temperature and condensing temperature, or depending on whether you're using a temperature probe or whether you're using a pressure transducer. But in most cases, they're using just a temperature probe. And that's often a lot of what they're driving it off of, sometimes discharge temperature. But again, your techs don't have access to that, and not every brand is the same. So it's hard to know. The point I'm making here is it's sometimes hard to know whether it's charged correctly or not. And that's where, when in doubt, weigh it out. Example, Carrier Infinity VS, it's charged for a 15-foot line set. You add 0.6 ounces per foot of 3/8 tubing. That's universal. So like this amount that you add based on the tubing size, that's not like a manufacturer thing. That's just universal depending on how much refrigerant can be held by that copper. Another thing that's really, really important when you're working on all equipment, this is true of all equipment, but especially inverter-driven equipment, pay attention to the long line guidelines. Because on some equipment, you actually have a line limit. Like you can't go above this. It won't even allow you to. Or you're not supposed to. So really pay attention to that. You do have to read it. Again, back to my primary encouragement, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, do not expect your installers to have read something that you did not read. There's two steps first. You read it, and then you interpret it to them. That is our responsibility if we want to have a good outcome. It's just the reality that we live in. You have to read it, and you have to interpret it to them. They're not going to just read it. Sometimes you get lucky and you have somebody who reads, but it's pretty rare.
Hey, Bryan.
Yes.
Didn't you have RTFM on the previous slide?
Yes, that is read the Fantastic Manual.
Oh, okay.
Yes, read the Fantastic Manual.
That's for you, not for them.
It's both. I mean, right, it's both. It's both, but again, you can't ever ask your people to do something that you haven't done. And that's a key distinction. I'm not going to go off on this speech here, but I'm not saying that you have to do the same things your people do every day, but you have to have done it. You have to demonstrate that you've done it. Everything that, I shouldn't say everything, the vast majority of things that I know and am able to teach are just because I've read manuals. That's it. And people are like, oh my gosh, how'd you learn that? I just read the manual. Right? Like that's all I did. And literally, I read it like 15 minutes ago. Like, and now I'm telling you. Like it's not. People, I had somebody. Actually, after the last time I did this class, this guy came up and he's like, man, how do you hold all that stuff in your head? Like, how do you? It's like I don't. Like, are you kidding me? No way. I'm putting together this presentation. I'm like re-remembering a bunch of stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've Googled something about air conditioning or refrigeration and had my own article pop up. I'm not kidding. Multiple times. I've used AI to answer a question, and at the end it said source HVAC school. Like, it's right. And it doesn't, it's just not there all the time. You all know this, and especially nowadays, you have to have, again, that old saying of, like, I've forgotten more than you ever knew. I mean, it's really true. And a lot of times it hardly stays in there for any length of time. It's like, well, let me check again. When you are charging, this is a key thing that's true of all equipment, but especially with inverter-driven equipment. When you have an accumulator, and a lot of them do, and you're adding refrigerant into the suction line on an operating system, which is the way to do it, right? That's how you do that. When you're adding liquid, you need to do it slowly, and you need to let it stabilize, especially with an accumulator. Because think of what an accumulator is. It's in the suction line right before the compressor. It holds refrigerant. That's what it's designed to do, is catch liquid refrigerant before it goes in the compressor. So when you put liquid refrigerant in that suction line and it dumps in that accumulator, it takes a while for that to then circulate. It doesn't just go right through like it used to. There's this adjustment time that has to happen. And if you get impatient, you will overcharge it. And it's funny because Jim Bergman and I, about 3 or 4 years ago, were doing a video out at our shop, and we were doing something. We were charging, and we were talking. I don't even remember what we were demonstrating, but he keeps adding charge, and then we look down, and we have 25 degrees of subcool. We're like, oops, now we gotta take some of that out. So that's really the biggest thing, and making sure that you're just not impatient with charging. A lot of people will ask, well, how do you charge your system when it's 35 degrees outside? How do you do, it's like, in a lot of cases, you're just weighing it, and then you set up that first 6 months maintenance or whatever in the summer season. I'm a really big fan, especially with high dollar installations. Obviously this is a performance contracting conference, so you all get this. I'm a huge fan of sending back commissioning techs. And if you are in the middle of winter and it's going to be really hard to do that properly, well then send them back in 6 months or whenever there's that first warming season. Because in a lot of cases, you're going to save yourself money. You're not doing that as like a favor to the client. You're doing it because you're doing that too. You care about the client, but you're trying to really prevent those long-term issues that you didn't catch before. And in many cases, there's additional upgrades you can do at that time as well. That's actually something we're learning to do now. We're still not great at it, but like, we don't want to be in attics doing upgrades in the middle of summer. Like, it's not really practical. It's practical if you want to practically die doing it. Or if you want to tell the customer they have to completely leave their house for multiple days while you cut the ducts loose and blow them in the attic and all that stuff. There's ways you can manage it, but it's not pleasant. But if you are going to change the box, kind of doing it in a staged way and then going back as part of that commissioning, retesting, testing in, testing out, all that. This is just showing that, like, specifically with this particular carrier unit, this is the system that's in my house, the type of system that's in my house. They have specific charging modes, and that's another RTFM thing. You need to know that, and if you don't know that the equipment that you're putting in has a specific charging mode, there's a good chance your installers don't either. And so you need to make sure that they understand that. And that's not just true of charging it the first time, right? That's if there's a leak or you got to change something, you got to do it every time. Everybody with me so far? Go ahead.
Just a quick note on those carrier or woodwork Bryan Evolution. When you install those 284 heat pumps and the evaporator is much higher than the outdoor unit, there are some requirements for a liquid line solenoid kit.
Yes.
That no one has on the shelf.
Yes, that's actually, I started talking about long lines and then I backed off, and that was actually what I wanted to point out. So often, you do not look at the accessories that are necessary. Things even like, and again, this isn't the case in inverter-driven equipment, but even things like hard start kits, solenoids being a really great example of that. And it varies. It depends on whether it's long line and they're at the same level, or whether the long line and the evaporator is above the condenser or condenser above evaporator, right? There's crazy cool stuff that you can learn, like static regain on your liquid line. In cases where your evaporator is below your condenser, you can actually downsize liquid line in some cases significantly. So if you're working on a big apartment complex and you want to reduce the overall total system charge and reduce your copper costs, you can do that, and it's completely valid to do it in that case. Again, we don't want to have more refrigerant in the system than we need. That's really no bueno. It causes all kinds of issues. And so that's the issue. One of the big issues with long lines is now you got oil return issues, and now you got more refrigerant than you potentially need. All right. I was told I only have 30 minutes left, so I'm gonna have to keep rocking here. Ductless is real tricky because the ductless manufacturers are even worse in terms of their transparency, generally speaking, than the unitary inverter-driven manufacturers. They're very tight to the vest with their algorithms. Weighing in refrigerant is still the best way when you're installing it, and really the best way is to weigh it in before you even break your vacuum. So you literally add the additional charge. If you need to add additional charge, add it while you're still actually under vacuum, so that way you don't even have to do anything once you start it up, just test it. Does that make sense what I just said there? So you're not waiting until it runs to start adding refrigerant. You just add it while it's under vacuum and then start it up. It's a time saver. And in terms of your install practices, can shave, 20 minutes off, because you're not doing that like adding and watching thing. One thing to know is, again, for most ductless systems, both lines are cold lines. You know that, right? They both have to be insulated. One is a saturated line, one is a suction line. One trick that Jim has sort of is pushing, and I think there's validity to it, is that if you measure the temperature of those two lines, they should be within about 5 degrees of each other in most cases. If they're more than 5 degrees different, that's a sign that you may be short on charge or have some other issue. Now again, what issue specifically, but as just a quick check, that is kind of a helpful thing in most cases. Most ductless systems run near zero superheat, meaning that suction line coming back is nearly the same temperature as the evaporator coil, and they're just relying on the accumulator to keep liquid from making it to the compressor, which is another reason they're critically charged, and so you can overwhelm that accumulator if you keep adding more charge. Now they have these algorithms in there that when it starts to see high compression ratio, the compressor will ramp down and all that, but you don't want to rely on that. It's not good for the equipment. And that's often what you'll see. A lot of times when ductless systems aren't producing the capacity they're supposed to, it's often because somebody added too much charge to them. I see that happen a lot. It's one of the most common things my techs do to me when they're not using a scale and they're trying to just use their arm, right? Calibrated shoulder. The other thing that's probably the best way is just to do delivered capacity. Just take probes above and in front. It's not easy to do. Like, how do you balance that sucker? And one of the first things you want to teach your new guys when they go to do a ductless is you don't put it right into the vein. Right? And it sounds hilarious, but it happens all the time. Like, it's like, seriously, guys, I mean, how many times? So it is something you definitely want to train to. One nice thing about ductless manufacturers is they generally give you pretty good airflow charts. And so they're going to tell you what your airflow is at different speeds, and they're usually pretty accurate, at least the ones that I've tested. I'm saying that, and there's probably some out there that don't at all. But if you go on the manufacturer's airflow, and then once you have airflow, doing delivered capacity is really easy. Something that was brought up in the last session that I want to address quickly, some people have talked about, well, if you have outdoor airflow, can you just do capacity on the condenser, right? So you just take the temperature sensible in and out on the condenser, run the sensible heat equation, and figure out your capacity that way. You folks understand what I'm saying here? The only downside to that is that you also have heat of compression. So it's going to be a higher number, and you don't know whether it's right or not. Could you use it? Sure, but it comes back down to the same fundamental darn problem that you would have almost had to take in a system that you knew was right, that was the same model, and pre-done all your testing and created your kind of your guidelines. The good news is this is something that I'm committed to really working more on. Working more on? That's what my wife calls me most of the time, or working more on. I don't know if she means something. Stupid joke. It happens all the time. You guys who listen to the podcast know stupid jokes are a huge part of my character. And like I said, when you have 10 kids, your dad jokes, and I just have like more kids, so I'm more dad than most people, so there's more dad jokes than most people. I think that's the reason. But what we want to do is do more testing on equipment so that we can give you guidelines when the manufacturers fail to do so, that give you something to go on to tell whether it's working properly or as expected. And also some recommendations on systems that work well and don't work well. I did notice, I don't know what saturated lines are, but I apparently made up a word there, so that's cool.